Well, Monday is here again, and I hope you guys are starting a good week. If you're listening to this later in the day, you know, I actually publish these or post them so that they'll go out at 6:30 on Monday morning. And so I know a lot of the people that watch them don't have time to watch them at that time of the day, and the views come trickling in later in the day. But if you've already had your Monday, or most of it, if you're watching this Monday night or later in the day on Monday, I hope your week started off well. But this is a little thing that I actually ran past the class I'm teaching at the college, except I've tweaked it a little bit. Over there at the college this summer, I'm teaching air conditioning 2 days a week, just to help out until the regular instructor, kicks in the fall. But there will be a test coming out tomorrow morning on this material, so you might want to watch for that one. That will come out tomorrow, which will be on a Tuesday, and let's see, it'll be the 16th. If you're watching this video a long time after I've released it, those dates won't mean anything to you. But air conditioning customers can usually find the money to get their AD fixed, even if their car is not running that well in any other way. They'll ignore other things to get their air conditioner fixed, because the air conditioning is really important. And if you fix somebody's air conditioner, all of us, particularly if you fix it without it costing them very much, or even if you fix it and they have to pay it, you're going to be a heroic person to them, because people's air conditioning is really important. Now, even if electric cars take over, air conditioning is still going to be a thing. Just like brakes and just like suspension and alignments and tires. Even if electric cars take over, there's a lot more to a car than an internal combustion engine. So there's always going to be work, particularly in the form of air conditioning. And if you look at a Tesla, the air conditioner charge ports, although they're using 1234, are still right there next to each other. The air conditioner on those is not driven with a belt, but nonetheless, you're still going to be dealing with air conditioning. And for a long time to come, air conditioning is going to be a thing. Now, do this before you tear into a dash. Take it for a test drive, watch the speedometer, the odometer, the wipers, the washers, the radio, and all that stuff. Make sure the engine's not running a little bit too hot. If it's running a little bit too hot, you may find it kicking the AC off and on. I drove an Aerostar one time, and they told me the air conditioner would stop cooling for about 5 minutes at a time, and that was one that didn't even have the data stream. And so I was monitoring finally when I drove it and I experienced that, I noticed it would kill the air conditioner compressor, wouldn't kick it on for 5 minutes or so. So when I got it back to my service bay, I went into the engine coolant temperature sensor and I measured it, and it was telling a lie. It was basically skewed a little bit to the hot side, and it was fooling the engine controller into thinking that the engine was running a shade too hot. And because it thought the engine was running a shade too hot, it would kick the compressor off until that engine, the thing, you could draw it on a graph, but it was just skewing a little hot. Anyway, that particular one needed an engine coolant temperature sensor, not because it was totally non-functional, but because it was just basically reading a little inaccurately. Back at the shop, make sure everything works, and list anything that doesn't. Scan and record diagnostic trouble codes. Now, this is if you're going to go deep into the AC. Now, if you're just basically looking at one that's short cycling and you see a leak, basically a sweaty hose or something, and you determine that's where your leak is, and you pop that on there and you pull the air out and put it back on there and make sure you put the right amount of oil in there and all that kind of thing. That's a little different. But if you're having to go into the dash, primarily is what a lot of this stuff is talking about. Look at the condition of the dash if you are going to have to go into it. If it's got cracks like this, most of your newer vehicles have just got hard plastic dashboards that aren't going to crack. And it took a long time for the people that are making cars to learn not to make these padded dashboards that would crack in the sun. But time-stamped digital pictures can settle arguments. Like if you've got cracks on the dash, or if you've got dents on the car, or if you've got a crack in the windshield, or if you've got a cigarette burn on a seat, if you go out there before you do anything and you take pictures of everything and you time-stamp them, you set up your camera or your cell phone or whatever you're using. Everybody's got a camera in their pocket these days, so you don't have to go buy a camera to do this. Save those in if possible, save them in a folder on your OneDrive or whatever that's flagged for that particular car. And if the time when you save them, the time at which you save them in that folder will be stamped at the time you took the picture. One time there was a guy that came, took his car, and I was the only one in the shop that had worked on it, and the only one that had been in the car. And this guy came wheeling his car back into the Ford place, and he told the service manager, he says, somebody burned my seat with a cigarette, and I want a new seat cover. And so the service manager looked at the work order and said, you're not getting a new seat cover out of us because the guy that worked on your car doesn't smoke. And he was the only one that was in that car. But sometimes, not all customers are like that, but there's a lot of them that will try to get something for nothing, even when they knew they had a problem going in there. So take a picture. It's a smart thing to do, to walk around the car and look at this paint and see if there's any scratches on it or anything like that, and take those pictures. Take pictures of the tires and the wheels and whatever else you think if there's damage there. I'm not saying you need to take a picture of all four sides of the car all the time, but anywhere you see any damage, take a picture and timestamp the photo. That way you'll have it for your defense later on. Make sure all the fan speeds work, the airflow doors operate like they should before you ever start on it, including the temperature control blend board. If you find something else wrong with it, you might want to tell them, hey, look, I haven't started working on the car, but I did notice that whenever I turn it on floor, most of it still goes out in the defrost. Do you want us to look at that while we got it in there? And just tell them that going in, so they won't have you working on the air conditioner and then come back and say, hey, since you worked on my air conditioner, blah, blah, blah. You know what I'm talking about. Look under the hood, make sure the heater hoses and the AC lines and the accumulator are connected. Make sure all the cooling fans work. This one here was one I took a picture of that we had that was smoking. See that smoke pouring out of that thing? I don't know if you can see it or not, but there's that smoke that was coming out of there. And that one there's you can see it down there too. That was a burned up fan motor. And so you need to be paying attention to that kind of thing too. It's not a bad idea also, if somebody is complaining about their pop-off going or head pressure going too high, if you'll go ahead and do that thing with the test light and hook it to the wire going out to the fan and turn the fan through and see if the light goes out. If the light goes out while you're turning the fan through and you've got a bad condenser fan, it might keep you from having a comeback. That's something else you can check going in, because you want to make sure that you find as much stuff as you can that might cause it to come back on you, and have you do free work because you didn't catch it going out. The crazy thing about those fans that just have one or two open commutators in them is that thing can kick off and on every time in your service bay and not kick on when you're down at the favorite stop light right after you've left the dealership. And it's real easy for them to have the idea that you did something wrong if they basically have you working on the air conditioner, and then the air conditioner pop-off goes because it stopped on one of those dark spots when the fan was turning and the relay put juice out there and the fan didn't run. So not a bad idea to go ahead and check the fan anyway too. There was a lady that I knew one time that had this Oldsmobile, and it was like a 96 model, I think, or something like that. No, it wasn't 96, it was 86. It was a station wagon, and one way or another, it was one of those with a little four-cylinder and a throttle body injection on it. It was like a Cutlass station wagon. And she told me, she says, my car just all of a sudden started stalling whenever I was leaving work. And she stopped at a store and she'd call me. And she was somebody I knew pretty well. So I said, well, let me go over and see what I can see on that. Took the top off the air cleaner, and I looked at the little, throttle body injector there. It just had one. And whenever she cranked it up, and it was the injector was spraying in a real ragged fashion, and the engine stalled. And after the engine stalled and it wasn't turning anymore, the injector was still squirting. And so what I smelled was a smoking, burned up fan like that one there. Okay, so this burned up smoking fan that I had, I said unplugged the burned up smoking fan, and when she started it up with the fan unplugged, the engine ran perfect. And she said, what do I need to do? I said, turn off your air conditioner. As long as you're in the wind and this fan's not running, you'll be okay. When you get back over to, the town where, I lived in the same town she did, and we both worked in the town up the road. I said, we'll put you a fan on there. So I went and dropped by the parts house on the way home, picked up a $40 fan, swapped out the fan that night, whenever I went over there and got that took care of. And so she didn't have any more trouble with that thing running. But that fan created a lot of electrical noise that went sweeping across the wires in the engine compartment, and the induced signal, bogus signal going into the engine controller made no sense, made it think the engine was still spinning, and so it was just making all that injector spray. But a burned up fan can do amazing things. You notice this fan right here is interesting too. It's got this shroud on it that's made to catch some of the wind coming through here and funnel it back around there to keep that fan cool. So apparently that fan motor on that one was prone to get too hot anyway. I don't even remember what kind of car that was on, but I took that picture in the shop one day when we were working on that car. Now when you're under the dash, pay attention to anything that looks out of place or poorly repaired. If somebody's fooled with the wires and taped them up and done anything else with all that, if they've tinkered with the air conditioner, if you see something like a air door motor or something that's only half mounted and it's wobbling around, or especially pay attention to it, they'll notice this and usually have it written up if you have a motor going click, 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 click or something like that and it's got busted teeth on it or whatever. Watch under the dash before you start on that. Make sure even when you're under the dash you're wearing some kind of safety glasses. I was wondering under the dash on a Taurus one day, something fell in my eye and I couldn't figure out what it was, and when I went over there to the walk-in clinic to get it taken care of, that guy swabbed a piece of looked like a piece of glass out of my eye that was as big as a grain of rice, and it came from under the dash when you never would have expected anything to fall in your eye. This would not be an intermittent problem. The old burned up clutch, you've seen them things right there. That's easy to spot visually, and you know that called for, you could replace just the compressor clutch, but a lot of times just the compressor clutch is going to be really expensive by itself. Now I have been in a situation where somebody had a locked up bearing, you know, on this pulley right here, and you could go on Amazon and buy a replacement pulley for $17 to fit that thing. We've actually replaced the bearing in these pulleys before in extreme circumstances. But if it's burned up like that, you know most of the time it's best just go ahead and replace the whole compressor if you can do it without charging $1,000, you know. All right, these are the calls where the AC system gets cold. So you feel the thing. That's my hand in my vehicle, by the way, you might know. Then it quits cooling anywhere from a few minutes to a day or more. That's similar to the one I was talking about earlier. But if you get a call where it starts out cooling good every single time when you first start it, and then it drops out, then that's basically going to be a problem with one of these four things. It's going to be a relay, it's going to be a pressure switch, it's going to be a clutch coil, or it's going to be a blend door. Now, occasionally, my buddy Donnie had one that this guy kept having to replace the fuse going to the clutch coil on his 06 Malibu. And so he told the guy, he says, your clutch coil is partially shorted. Now it starts out pulling the AC clutch in, but then after a little bit it goes up more than the fuse can handle, pops the fuse. And the guy had bumped it up from to a 25 amp fuse or whatever, and it still did it. And so Donnie says, if you will come over here Monday, I will replace your compressor clutch and you won't have that problem anymore. Well, the car never showed up. And so when the guy did come back, he looked at where that fuse was, and there I had took a piece of 12 Romex wire and bent it in, stripped it, insulation off, bent it into a horseshoe and rammed it down in there where the fuse went, because he was going to keep that air conditioner going. Well, he burned up the wire harness, caused melt wire to melt into a bunch of other ones, and there was just all kinds of problems the car had by that time. And so Donnie says, well, he checked and you couldn't get a wire harness for that car. If you buy one from a salvage yard, they don't unplug anything, they just clip all the connectors off of it. And he said, I can split this harness and I can fix all of these places where it's burned up. You're going to pay me M time, which means you're going to pay me $65 an hour, or whatever you charge, for every hour that I work on this thing. If it takes me 10 hours, it's going to cost you $650 for me to fix the wire harness. And so the guy drove that thing away and decided he just wasn't going to have it fixed, which I don't know how long that lasted. The blend door can be a problem too on the intermittent problem. This is not as much of a problem usually as this or that. Now this right here, not very often. This right here, not very often. If it's intermittent, I'm talking about. All right. Sometimes it may take an hour or more for it to show up. Hook up the gauges, start the motor, set the blower control head to full cold, set the blower speed to the lowest setting. I like to roll the windows up too. Press the max or recirculation button and set the engine RPM to 1500 RPM. You'll have to have a way to do that. Everybody's got their own little way of making that happen. And let that thing run. You want that thing to cycle off and on as many times as it can, because whenever it cycles off and on, a lot of times that's when you'll find your problem. So once it cycles off and it doesn't cycle back on, you'll kind of know what's going on. Put the thermometer probe in the middle vent, wait and watch. The idea is to make it cycle. Just cycle as much as you can while you're watching that thing right there. All right. You can feel the pressure switch with your fingers, and you'll feel it click off and on. You can also put your finger on the relay if you know where it is, and you can feel that clicking off and on. And so that will tell you if this right here clicks off and it clicks back on and the compressor doesn't kick in, you know, you got some information there you can use. Same with the relay. If the relay clicks off and then it clicks back on, the compressor clutch doesn't follow, you know, you need to check a little further. After the engine has reached full operating temperature, move the temperature control to full hot and back to full cold. Go hot, cold, feeling of the air, watching your thermometer, whatever. See if that's working like it's supposed to. If you turn it one way and the other once or twice and it doesn't respond, then you're going to know that you got some kind of an issue with the blend door trying to stick. And it's, you know, somewhere along there. Now, as soon as the vent temperature starts to rise while it's on full cold setting, look to see if the compressor is still running. If you see that thermometer going up, if you don't hear that compressor click back on, you know, you're going to know something. But it's best to look down there at it. If it is still running, look at the blend door and the water control valve. Water control valve's in there, stops it. It will usually, on the newer ones, whenever the heater control valve is in a position where it's closing off, so you're not getting the hot water in your heater core, it's going to actually bypass through that heater control valve and go back just so it can still have that bypass function on all that. That's the most common way that's done. There was a time back in the day when the heater control valve was in the heater hose going to the motor. Going to the heater core, and it would close off and just stop that. And then you had another bypass hose in that kind of circumstances where it could still bypass. Intermittent AC problem. If the compressor is not engaged, check the clutch circuit, find the relay terminal leading to the clutch, and you should see a ground coming through the clutch using a low impedance test light. I've talked about this over and over and over again. It's one of the best ways you can find bad fuel pumps this way. You can check the fan this way. If you can find that terminal going out to that component, you have a test point right there that was fairly easy to access on most vehicles for whatever it is you're testing. Now there's that diode right there I talked about in the last video I made. But anyway, I just basically abbreviated this. Look here for a ground. If you don't see a ground here, you got issues somewhere down here. Okay? You may either have a ground problem, you may have a problem with the clutch, and all that. Now also sometimes this diode will go bad and it'll turn into a direct short, and it will basically, they'll usually pop this fuse up here whenever you see something like that. Alright, so if no clutch engagement but power is present at the clutch, tap the front of the clutch. Now make sure if it's going to be turning this direction, typically on a vehicle that's if the engine is in the vehicle so that you're standing with the hood open looking straight at the front of the engine, it's going to be turning this way, right? Now if you're working on something like a Mitsubishi or a Honda Civic or something, so the engine is sideways and the belts and stuff are over on the right side of the car, that engine is going to turn the opposite direction when you're looking at the pulleys. It's going to turn clockwise. This one's going to turn clockwise, right? If the belt and pulleys are on the passenger side, it's going to turn clockwise. If your belts and pulleys are on the driver's side, in other words, facing the driver's side fender, it's going to turn counterclockwise. So you need to pay attention to which way that motor's turning. And if this is turning this way, you want to tap it. You don't want to tap it on this side if it's turning that way, because it may throw whatever you tap it with back in your face. So tap it over here and let it click in. And if it clicks in and then when it cycles back off, it doesn't click in again, that's when you're going to measure your air gap and adjust it the way that you need to do it. On some of the GM, you got to have a special tool that presses it off and on. I hate that. But on a lot of the Chryslers and Fords, you just take that bolt out and pull it off and change, take some shims out and all that. And you can get the little shim assortments for those things too. Sometimes you can just pull it off and you can find 2 or 3 shims in there and just take one shim out and it's a little closer. But with the wear that happens between this and that pulley, it's not unusual for that gap to get too wide. And this particular one I had showed and looked up was 14 to 30 thousandths of an inch, which is a fairly 35 hundredths to 75 hundredths of a millimeter. It's really kind of funny because I was telling my students one time, I says 40 thousandths of an inch in one millimeter, the same thing. They said, okay. And I said, so if I've got something that's 25 hundredths of a millimeter, how many thousandths of an inch it is? All you got to do is pick a fourth of 40 and you got 10 thousandths. Well, boy, they just go into a tailspin when you ask them a question like that. Something else I'd ask, I'd say, an 11 millimeter, last week I was talking to one of these students, I says an 11 millimeter is the same as a 7/16 when you get our inch sizes. I said, so if an 11 millimeter is the same as an 11/16, I mean, it's a 7/16, I'm sorry. I said, if you've got a 22 millimeter, what size is that wrench? He said 14/16. Well, he kind of had the right idea, but he didn't find the least common denominator. It's exactly 7/8, which 14/16 and 7/8. That's kind of funny too. With the AC engaged and evaporator inlet and outlet warm, the high side and low side in a vacuum, you're probably going to have an expansion valve or an orifice problem. Interestingly enough, though, this is a, you're going to find anomalies that don't meet this. One time I was working on a Toyota over there, me and the students were, and it had a full charge, but both of these were reading low. That one's reading down here, and this one's reading, as I remember, not nearly as high as it should have been, and that was reading almost in a vacuum. It wasn't reading actually in a vacuum, but it was real low, close to zero. But it was, whenever you switched it off, and it took a while, took a long time, but it would equalize. It takes a long time to equalize, that's an indicator too. Usually that'll be an expansion valve, although there's a clogged orifice. I took a picture of it we had over there. So it can theoretically cause that too. But on this Toyota we were working on, we changed out the expansion valve, and it didn't change anything. It was giving us the same readings, it wouldn't cool, and so I said, well, it's going to have to be something in the evaporator. And so we went ahead and replaced the evaporator and took care of the problem. The pressures normalized, the AC got cold. What was weird about that was I actually took this, for sake of argument, I took a blower and I blew some air through the evaporator, and it seemed like it passed air just fine. I don't know what in the Sound Hill was going on in that thing. May have had something that was moving whenever liquid was in there, I don't know. But anyway, so if your static pressure is 90 on both sides, poor cooling, compressor running, this one here says 70 on the low side, 170 on the high. This is an actual vehicle that we worked on over here. And watch what happens whenever I check it with my thermometer. Check it with the thermometer, 86 degrees coming out there. Ambient temperature is like, a little over 80 degrees that day, and that's what we got coming out of there. We had a compressor failure on that particular one. We had to pop a compressor on it. That's what was wrong with it. A lot of vehicles today have dual zone his or her systems in their call. One side's warmer than the other. It may be low on refrigerant, but this is true even on single zone. If it's not a his and hers, if it's a single zone, if it's an Asian car, sometimes if it's low on refrigerant, one side will be colder than the other. And so what you do right here is when you can't feel the inlet or the outlet, at the same time put temperature probes and watch those temperature probes. If you're seeing like 49 degrees over here and 56 over here or whatever, so you're going as far as you can from each other to read these temperatures. Note the difference in temperature, and then add refrigerant really slowly and see if both of them come to the same temperature. Now it's a little more complicated if you've got dual blend doors and all this kind of stuff, and a lot of times you'll have the upper, on some of the dual zones, you'll have the upper and the lower parts of the evaporator giving you the different sides. Some of these Jaguar type heater systems may have a heater control valve, that's got two sides of the heater they're feeding to, with little solenoids to make that happen, a duty cycle and all that hogwash. But anyway, that's how you do that. A low system usually indicates that there's a leak, but not always. If it's been a long time since it's been checked, there'll be a little molecular bleed through. With today's vehicles using less refrigerant, every ounce counts. Back in the day, it used to be 3-4 pounds. Now it may be a pound or less that the refrigerant's got in there, and it doesn't have to lose very much before you'll start to notice it. And once again, it may cool just fine at night, but not in the heat of the day. All right, system charged toward the lower end of its spec range may work well in lower temperatures and lower humidity. Now this is going to be a surprise to some people. Clogged cabin air filters can cause low airflow out the vents and can cause liquid refrigerant to enter the compressor, and you know how damaging that can be. If you're on a vehicle with an expansion valve, so there's no accumulator between the evaporator and the compressor, you may wind up in a situation where if the airflow is being blocked by a clogged cabin air filter, and that's more common, a lot of times people they don't even think about their cabin air filter. So when it comes in, if you check that thing, you'd be surprised how many times you can sell them one. Look at this. Oh man, that looks terrible. Put me one of those in there, you know. So if there's not enough airflow across the evaporator to evaporate the refrigerant that's going through the evaporator, you may get liquid refrigerant leaving the evaporator headed for the compressor. Now, does that happen a lot? But it's more prone to happen if you've got clogged filters. But also, my buddy Donnie on an old Chevrolet, he found this clogging when he looked in there with his snap-on scope, the borescope. He found that all clogged up inside there, and that had to be cleaned out to make the air conditioner work right. This guy's air conditioner wasn't cooling. Now that one had an accumulator on it, and so the liquid wasn't making it to the compressor, but he didn't have any air worth a flip on that thing, because no air could go through it, wasn't evaporating, just, you know, going through there. So that was a big mess right there. Most cabin air filters are fairly easy to get to. Some of them are out there under the cowl panel. Some of them are in here behind the glove box. Some of them are up in there where you reach up in there right where the bulkhead is, and they'll be mounted vertically. Some of the Teslas have got a great big one, and out there under the, you know, in the frunk area, and they'll also have another one in there behind the glove box, or you know, like Tesla 3s have got just one air filter, one cabin air filter, and it's up in there coming through the cowl vent and all that. Anyway, just look it up. Not every vehicle has a cabin air filter. My Explorer don't have one. My wife's pickup doesn't have one. My pickup doesn't have one. So you can't always count on a vehicle having a cabin air filter. But I remember I was talking the other day, some of your Lexus cars, they had ultraviolet lights in there to kill bacteria. They had a horseradish in the filter to kill bacteria and all that kind of stuff. They was probably would have killed COVID too at the time. One of the most important air conditioning components and one of the most overlooked is the fan clutch. That little spiral spring's bimetal, and it changes the viscous coupling on the inside so that whenever heat comes through here, causes it to turn that little valve. It makes the fan more match the speed of the engine. The reason they put these on there is because the fan takes power to spin, and if you don't want it basically robbing power all the time. If you have one of these things lock up, it'll rob power from the vehicle, sound like an airplane taking off. So if you switch off the vehicle and you grab that fan and you can't move it you're not be able to grab the fan and just move it very easy by hand with the engine switched off. But what I did on this one here, she basically, her head pressure was going up really high and her air conditioner would start out cooling, but then the cooling would go away, and the higher the head pressure went, the less cooling she got. And so I noticed when I put a fan in front of this radiator, and condenser blowing through there, the head pressure would drop, cooling would stay, and we wound up putting a fan clutch on that one. Took care of her whole problem. That one was hard to troubleshoot because it's really, unless you got one of those things where you put luminous tape on the pulley and on the fan, and then you can read the RPM and watch it. You can do it with a timing light, point the timing light at it, blinking on the, hook it up to the coil wire or whatever, and a lot of times you can tell if the speed of the pulley and the speed of the fan are closely matched. That's sort of subjective, but the point I'm trying to make is, if you got to make sure you don't have those fuzzy dog fennel, plant material that has gone through the condenser and been trapped at the radiator too, because sometimes, I talked about that before, you can't see that unless you find a way to get down in there with your borescope, or pull the rubber flap out of the way and look down there, or pull the radiator loose and, tilt it forward, see if it's, messed up or whatever. Here you go, old school AC shop poster. Automotive AC systems have numerous components. They don't always fail at the same time. Blended refrigerants are never recommended. A lot of, for years, people were making refrigerants that had propane, butane in it, and all that kind of stuff. I've actually seen some of that when I use my refrigerant identifier. Refrigerant leaks can be difficult to find. Sometimes die in driving time are the only way to successfully identify a leak. See, you can pull a vacuum on it, but the only amount of pressure you're working with if you pull a vacuum on it to see if it leaks down a vacuum is the difference between atmospheric pressure and a vacuum, which is only like 15. It's at 15 psi at sea level. That's a round number. But if you put nitrogen in it and you put like 150 pounds in there, that's a bigger pressure differential. It's 10 times as much pressure inside the system as it is outside the system. And you got some soap bubbles, you'll usually find it that way. And then there's the dye you can put in there and drive it, or let them drive it for the weekend, and then get up under it and look around with your black light and see what you see there. A bad clutch or condenser fan will reduce coolant and can internally damage or destroy the compressor because the head pressure goes really, really high. Most compressors have got a pop-off valve though, so the pressure goes out. It'll go, you may see steam coming out from under the hood and hear a funky noise whenever it happens. An AC system has been empty for weeks or months, might not immediately show a leak after charging because the leak may be really, really, really small. And a super small leak on an AC is difficult to find. It really is. A repair estimate's only an estimate. There may be issues not detectable that may emerge after the initial repair. Refrigerant leaks never fix themselves. And stop leak only causes more problems. To stay cooler, use low to medium fan speeds and max recirc, and you'll get better fuel economy that way too. Avoid long periods of idling with the car in AC on in hot weather to prolong the life of your car's AC system. Now there used to be more truth to that than there is now. I will also follow up by saying that if you're sitting in a drive-through or in a traffic jam for a long time where you need the air conditioner running and you don't want the transmission to overheat, you need to kick the transmission up in neutral, because as that torque converter is shearing that fluid, it's creating heat. And I've actually seen situations where trucks or cars were sitting for a long time in traffic. I'm talking about a long time, like 45 minutes or an hour under a really hot day, and they'll start puking transmission fluid out the vent on the transmission because the fluid starts to boil because they had it in drive. The torque converter is what makes the heat in the transmission. As that torque converter is shearing the fluid and the heat continues to go up, there's not enough airflow through the transmission cooler to cool it off, and so on and so forth. If you put it in neutral, that thing's it's not shearing the fluid. So if you're in Chick-fil-A drive-through for a long time, just make sure you remember, pay attention to what you're doing. Don't accidentally put it in reverse and back into the car behind you like that kid on American Graffiti did. But anyway, in neutral, let it sit there and idle, drop it in drive, pull forward, put it back in neutral. That'll help it stay cool. And also, it doesn't use quite as much fuel whenever you don't have it in drive because it doesn't have a load on it. Anyway, there's going to be a test tomorrow morning. I want to know how you guys did on that. And so I'm going to go in, and tomorrow morning will be Tuesday. This one will be released on Monday. Today it'll be Monday for you guys that are watching this. And I will see, as I look at your comments, what you thought of the video. And next time, I'll have a little more for you to talk about. See you later.